Hi, I'm Mr. Simons, and here we go with part 3 of our fiscal policy series. In previous videos, we've covered the first 3 bullet points there. In this video, we're going to look at financing a budget deficit and what can you do with a budget surplus. You can spend it. Spoiler alert. Okay, if we go back to these two concepts of a budget deficit and a budget surplus. If I'm talking about a budget deficit, this is where government spending exceeds revenue. So this is a situation where the government is either experiencing a situation, it's increasing government spending and or it's seeing less tax. So expenditure and revenue. If I have a budget surplus, well, then I've got a situation where, as a government, they are earning more than they are spending. So in this situation that the government is earning more revenue and or it's spending less. So those are the two major outcomes that we're going to deal with. So the budget deficit and the budget surplus. So if the government runs a budget deficit, if it gets into such a crazy situation like this, then it has to find the funds from somewhere to finance the gap between all the money it's spending and the lower sum of money that it's earning. But how does it do this? Good question. The financing source one comes from Australia's private sector. So all the banks and other financial institutions that exist in the Australian economy. So the Australian government could seek to borrow the funds from within Australia. It could do that. But Australia has a limited pool of national savings. Australia is famously a net capital importer and brings in more capital from overseas than it can lend to other people. So if the government tries to borrow heaps of money domestically, this could push out other borrowers, like people that are borrowing for a house or for a business, because people would prefer to lend to the government. The government's pretty low risk. And if the government borrows all of the local savings, that could lead to higher interest rates for everyone. So this effect is not something that I've just made up for the purpose of this video. That this is known as the crowding out effect. That what is happening is that the government is crowding out all the other borrowers, and this could push up interest rates, making private sector investment more difficult. So, to summarise, the Australian government could borrow funds locally, but it's likely to crowd out all the other borrowers. The more likely option, and what the government uses, is to borrow from overseas to finance the deficit or to finance the difference between spending and revenue. So remember, Australia is an open economy. So as a country, we can borrow from overseas, we can interact with the international sector, we have that opportunity. But remember, if the government borrows money from overseas, that this is going to affect the current account deficit. So if we borrow from overseas, that's going to increase foreign liabilities. Those foreign liabilities will have to be serviced, and that could potentially further increase the current account deficit. So Australia can borrow from overseas, but that will affect our current account deficit and external stability. Can you summarize all this for us? All right, I think I can do that. So let's look at borrowing from the private sector first. So to borrow from the private sector, the government would issue new Commonwealth Government securities, or CGSs, and sell them to the private sector to get the money to finance the budget deficit. However, this could lead to the crowding out effect. The government could also borrow from overseas, and when a government does borrow from overseas, it adds to Australia's foreign debt. And remember, foreign debt can lead to greater servicing costs, greater debits on the NPY account and the current account could lead to a higher current account deficit. So these are the main options in terms of financing a budget deficit. And then what happens when a government runs a budget surplus, when it's got more money than it needs to spend? The government's really got a couple of options. The first thing is it could deposit the surplus funds with the RBA and come back to them later, a rainy day that Australia might experience. It could use the surplus to pay off government debt, not private debt, that's not the government's debt, but it could use it to pay off public sector debt. Or it could create investment funds. It could set up an investment fund that will pay off a bit of money each year to cover different issues. For example, in the past, the government has created investment funds to deal with the superannuation liabilities of public sector workers, healthcare, infrastructure. Those are some of the options that a budget surplus can be used for. In terms of fiscal policy, there are 5 things we've looked at across 3 videos. Make sure you check them out. Make sure you subscribe, leave a comment, and also check out some of the other videos that might be relevant for your economics study. Thanks for watching.